has been criticism of S-Jam and Joe's team for picking Zhilei Zhang the first time around. Not for the rematch, because then he had to fight him again to get back into position, but for picking him the first time when perhaps a different opponent may have been better. What's your view on that?
Yeah, look, I mean, in 2022, I think we went like 26 unbeaten or whatever. And I think matchmaking is difficult because you want your boxers to be in really competitive fights, but you don't want to lose. And I think what I wouldn't want to come out of this is for people to encourage people to take less challenging fights because the manager or the team's worried about how they look if the person loses. You know, there was a big team of us that decided on that fight, right from the promoter to the trainer to me. We all looked at it. And, you know, our logic at the time was sound. Our logic at the time was sound. Zhilei Zhang was coming off a defeat to Ergovic, although arguably won. His engine was not great after 5 rounds. We saw that in the first fight. Zhang really began to decrease, and we thought Joe would take over. So the logic was sound. It just didn't work out in the end. But, you know, you can't beat yourself up every time you lose and congratulate yourself every time you win. It's one of those things. In hindsight, doesn't look like great matching, but what we've got to make sure of is that as Joe progresses in his career, we learn our lessons from that and we move on. If Joe goes out and, you know, this year beats Daniel Dubois and beats Joseph Parker, he's going to be right at the top of the division again. And no one will worry about that. And that's the great thing about the heavyweight division. It's like show business. The heavyweight division is like show business. They want big characters. Joe's a big character. He is now, you know, TNT and the Warrens put a ton of money into Joe. And albeit the worst year of his career, no doubt, he was watched by a lot of people and is now a real named heavyweight, and he will get a lot of work.
We'll go back to Joe in a few minutes, but I just want to ask you, there's been strong rumours that at the launch press conference for Joshua and Ngannou later today, it's possible it could be announced that Zhang and Parker may face each other on that card. By the time people watch this, we'll know if that's come to fruition or not. But if that were to take place, who would you fancy in that? How would you see it going?
Oh, it's a great fight. I've heard that today as well. Strong rumor. I think you saw from Parker Wilder that Parker and his trainer Andy Lee can devise a very specific game plan, as they did for Wilder, to avoid the right hand. And, you know, they'll have another specific game plan for Zhang. They'll be thinking the same we did, which was drag Zhang into deep waters. Later on, Parker will take over. Initially, I think many people think Zhang, big puncher, probably too much for Parker. I think it'll be a terrific fight. Zhang and his team are tremendous people, as is Joseph Parker. It's effectively the battle of the good guys, that is. And very, very tight fight. I see the argument for both of them. I actually think I quite like Joseph Parker in it.
And then that could lead to a rematch with Joe, as you say. I mean, he's got the victory over him in what was a very entertaining fight, grueling for both men, of course, but great for those of us who weren't in the fray. How likely is that rematch, or is the Dubois rematch more likely for Joe?
I mean, look, Joe's got to have his comeback first. He's got to have a fight. He's got to win that. But yeah, those rematches are all on the table. So are all the other fights at the top of the division. Joe Joyce has got to re-establish himself and show who he is, the person we all know him to be. He has not overnight become a bad fighter.
How exciting is it to have a heavyweight in the highest level of the sport at a time when Turki Al Sheikh and his team have come in a big way with Riyadh season, and that seems to be hugely beneficial for the fighters, certainly.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, you know, Queensbury are leading on that. We've got a very close relationship with them. We've spoken about Joe going to Saudi. Obviously got Solomon Dakers with them now as well. We've spoken about our heavyweights going to Saudi, and they'll go there at the right time. Right now, Joe should make his comeback in England. He's got a camp in England. He should make his comeback in the first quarter of this year. And then we should be thinking about big fights. But, you know, I think there's a lot of money in Saudi. There's a lot of money in Saudi, and that's obviously very attractive to people. But for as many big fights happen in Saudi, Joshua Ngannou, Fury Usyk, maybe even Fury Joshua, if that came to fruition, it means there's a big gap in the UK for big heavyweight fights to take place. And, you know, I, for one, would like Joe Joyce to step into that gap and have big fights in the UK and be the guy that fights in the UK. Why couldn't we have Joe Joyce, Daniel Dubois in the UK? I think that would do 20, 25,000. And there's not that many big fights that are going to happen in the UK. That's the danger. I mean, I'm all for what's going on in Saudi. I think it's brilliant for the sport. But are you going to remove a lot of big fights in the UK? Probably, and especially big heavyweight fights. Think of the British heavyweights. I mean, you've got kind of the Fabio Wardley British title level, and those guys all fighting for that. I mean, even that fight took place in Saudi, didn't it?
Yeah, British title fight out there. I mean, are you getting any suggestion from the Dubois team that he's interested in that rematch?
To be honest with you, I've not even gone there yet. I've not even gone there. I think we've got to look what's ahead of us. We'd be getting ahead of ourselves if we did that. But I do think Daniel would be interested in that fight. That's outside of the mega names, outside of the AJs and the Furies. Joe Joyce and Daniel Dubois are the next best two. I don't think there'll be much dispute of that. Dillian White's off on his drug ban. Derek Chisora is effectively semi-retired. That's whichever way round you want to say it. That's number 3 and 4 British heavyweights. They should fight each other. They should fight each other in a big all-British clash in the summer, I think. That's what should happen. But no, I haven't reached out to Dan Dubois' management. I know he's got a good team around him. He's got Don around him now, Martin Bowers, good people. In the first fight, it was very civil between us. And yeah, I think that's a great potential fight. But, let's see if it happens.
And there was some questioning at the time of Joe's second defeat to Zhang if he should carry on at all. That's clearly something you've decided that he will go back into the ring and at a good level. But did you ever consider talking to him about retirement?
I don't know where that came from. I mean, it's easy to say there was talk of it, but if one person says it, does that mean there's talk of it? I mean, Joe never said it, but I think
no. I mean more speculation, people suggesting it, not necessarily people involved.
Sure. I mean, yeah, I think people suggested it probably of AJ when he lost to Usyk for the second time. To be fair,
yeah,
I think people will suggest it. I think you're always looking at that as a boxing manager. You want to look after your boxer, and he is 38 years old. It was never on my mind. I was never contemplated by me or by Joe. But yeah, if some people want to talk about that, they can talk about it.
What would you say to kind of, I mean, you don't have to convince anyone, you're under no obligation, but how would you convince people that Joe doesn't need to retire yet?
That's an interesting question. I don't think anyone needs to convince people he doesn't need to retire. It's ultimately it's a question for him. I think a different question could possibly be, why is Joe Joyce still relevant? Why is he interesting to watch? Like, people might have short memories, but coming off his win in Parker in September 23rd, 2022, he was seen as the wrecking ball of the division that no one wanted to face. Not a single person would face Joe. That was part of our issue with matchmaking him. Not a single person would face him. I mean, if Zhang loses to Parker, I don't know who was going to fight Zhang, because he's then going to have no WBO interim, and he's a machine. He's a monster machine. So he will be Mr. No one wants to fight him. So Zhang's career, I'm not saying he's older than Joe, but not that he should retire from it, but he will find it almost impossible to get fights if he loses to Parker, because he's so dangerous and he won't have any goods. Joe Joyce doesn't have the WBO interim anymore, but still has the goods in terms of recognition factor and TNT and the Warrens backing him. There are so many good fights for Joe out there, so many interesting fights. And when you have a guy with that style come forward, takes a lot of punches, but he's never ever in a boring fight. And, as his management, you've got to look after him. You don't want him to take too much punishment. But Joe looks after himself. He's very healthy. Look at Beterbiev at 39. If you look after yourself and you don't abuse your body and you do the right things as Joe does, he's in incredible condition. He can go on and on. And Beterbiev's 39 in the light heavyweight division. Then won the heavyweight division where boxers have gone well into their 40s. So if he's healthy and he's fit, there are so many great fights for Joe Joyce.